So welcome this afternoon to this, I guess it's the first roundtable, and so the format that we're going to follow is that I will introduce the kind of round table, if you will, and then each of our colleagues will say something between 10 and 15 minutes, and then that should give us, after that, enough time for discussion. What I was asked to do, and then pass on to the panelists, though the panelists seem to have changed in different iterations of the program, and some may have been called as fill-ins, but that's okay, because the fill-in types will always have something to say, whether related to the kind of themes that I was asked to prepare. And so I'll just say just a few words about the themes, which some of you may have gotten or not, but some of you will pick up on in any case. And there are basically three themes that were suggested as possible topics for this round table. The first is what is or what should be Galicia. The second one is what is a Galician. And the third one, Galicia après Galicia, which we've heard today or earlier yesterday as a takeoff from Nicolas Yorga's Byzance après Byzance. Under the first topic of what is or what should be Galicia, this whole question of does Galicia begin in 1772, let alone was it invented in 1772, that is a place allegedly without a name, which seems a bit surprising since the whole justification that the Austrian government used was the medieval kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia. So in a sense we had the Hungarian justification for the acquisition. It was not being acquired, it was being returned to its rightful place in the Kingdom of Hungary, of whom the Habsburgs, in the interim during these 4.5 centuries of Polish occupation, was now coming back to its rightful homeland, the Kingdom of Hungary. And so this is the whole question of, when we're talking about Galicia, should we be talking about medieval Galicia? That is Galicia-Volhynia, the kingdom of Principality and later kingdom of Galicia and Volhynia. And then after that ends, for all intents and purposes, in the 14th century, late 14th century, we have this Polish Palatinate, or Palatinate called Rus Czerwona, Czerwona Rus. It's kind of interesting. We know that we have, fortunately, for Austrian Galicia, a Larry Wolff, who has enshrined that phenomenon in one's mind, and in many ways has said that this is the only Galicia that there is. Perhaps we need a Larry Wolff for Rus Czerwona. And maybe there is a Larry Wolff that already exists, namely someone who would be looking at this particular political entity or administrative entity as an end in itself, or as part of a continuum. A continuum that, began in medieval Galicia-Volhynia, it continued through minimally the Galician West Ukrainian Republic, and, a kind of political continuity, all of which is a construct, but then everything is a construct anyway. So this can be constructed and be justified and argued. And then, of course, is it only Austrian Galicia? We have the Galician West Ukrainian Republic. So these are the kinds of questions under what is or what should be Galicia. The second one is what is a Galician? Is it just those peoples who were numerically the largest, whether Ruthenians, Ukrainians, Jews, Poles. But what about the Germans or the Austro-Germans? Now, we've heard a little bit about that already, and of course, there was always a very influential Armenian community. There were even Karaite communities in Galicia. You know, what compromises Galicia as a Galician? And by the way, there are, which we haven't heard from anybody, other than maybe an aside, there were Russian Galicians. This sounds like an anomaly, but there were. And just as the concept of Galiciana was maintained in the emigration, so was the concept of a Russian Galician. And there are even places in the United States with statues of Naumovich, who was considered the leading Russophile in Galicia in the second half of the 19th century, namely the same Ruthenian, people of Ruthenian ethnicity who did not opt for the Ukrainian option, but who opted for the Russian option. Well, they too are part of the Galician story, or determining what is a Galician. And then if we're looking at all of these, what makes them distinct from their co-nationals or their co-ethnics? Is there something specifically Galician about them? Larry Wolff has looked at some of these things. Others have commented on them. In some cases they're obvious, in some cases they're not obvious. And then there's also a question of political and cultural preference. Why did, as for instance, and it's a question on the table, why did the Polish inhabitants of Galicia gravitate toward Poland? Strength of the Polish state, or the Polish nationalism that was very strong. Why did they not? How Piedmont? How much was it a real Piedmont? And similarly, the big question, to my mind, is why the Ruthenians, or those who became Ukrainian, who created a Piemonte, was recognized by themselves, by their co-ethnics in the southern part of the Russian Empire. Why did they not make it into a real Piemonte? This first comes up with the question of language standardization. Galician Ukrainians had their own form of Ruthenian. And for all intents and purposes, after long debates, they gave it up and followed the Eastern model, even though it was much more developed than Ukrainian in the South. That was one aspect of this. And the other thing was, during World War II, they had the best army. They could have continued to fight against Poland, but no, they decided to disperse their energies and get caught up in the conflagration of Eastern Ukraine. And that is because the Ukrainian national idea dominated their thought processes. That seemed to be more important. And then that raises the question of how much self-confidence Galicians had. On the one hand, they thought they were superior to those in the East. On the other hand, they felt that a Galician specificity would be insufficient. And then these, after, the question 3, Galicia après Galicia, how much does the idea of Galicia still exist? Can we still talk about Galicia? And we see nostalgia in post-communist Poland. Very interesting, which was touched on a little bit by our not so younger, but in my mind still younger colleague, Andrei Zaryanyuk, and that is the revival of Galicianism in Galicia in the last 20, 30 years, even to the degree of some arguing that we don't need the Cyrillic alphabet anymore. This is like going back to the question of the 1850s. Why should we write in Cyrillic? Let's write in the Roman or the Latin alphabet. And then finally, to go back to Rus Czerwona, or in its Russian form, Czerwonaya Rus. And that is the new Russophilism, as I say, under Putin. Putin, of course, looks at contemporary Ukraine. Ruski Mir has published ever since 2000, or supported publication or republication, reprints of all of this Russophile literature that appeared at the end of the 19th century and on the eve of World War I, that argues very simply that these people are Russians. This is part of the greater Zagranichная Rus. Zagranichная Rus, Russia abroad, was a common phenomenon before World War I. It's nothing new in the Russian mindset. And to the degree that, how this figures into, Galicia figures into, as formally part of Kiev and Rus, once again as part of the Russian world, since Russia has inherited Kiev and Rus in their minds forever. So these are the kinds of questions that I had suggested could be discussed, but now let us turn to our panelists and see what they would like to say about any of this or whatever else. And the first of our panelists is Maciej Janowski, and I had and I do, thank you very much for whomever prepared this, who is the director of the Tadeusz Manteuffel Institute of History, the Polish Academy of Sciences. He's marked here at Central European University, and he is a visiting professor there. General fields interested in Polish Central European history in the 19th, 20th century. I won't go through his long list of books, but he is the co-editor of a 3-volume work, A History of Modern Political Thought in East Central Europe. I'm assuming this is Zwischeneuropa, that is all of those lands from, including the Baltic lands.
From the Baltic to Albania.
To Albania, yes. But you've left out Crete and Greece,
yes.
But that's okay.
Well, actually, we wanted to have Greece, but we couldn't find a collaborator.
I see. Okay.
In writing about Greece in the
Good.
context of Eastern Europe.
So, please, Professor Janowski.
Yeah, sure.
Mythical
time you can have it.
Mythical microphone. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, well, I would like to start by thanking very much for invitation for this conference, which is extremely interesting to me and also moving in a sense, because I can see some of my colleagues whom I have seen at various moments at other conferences, and now have opportunity to see them again, but also because I can meet in person authors whose texts I have known and about whom I have known from literature. Now I see that they are real persons.
Are you disappointed?
No, I'm fascinated.
That can happen.
So once again, thank you very much. I'm extremely happy to be here. And now I have 10 minutes to answer all the questions that Professor Magochi was giving, which I will not even try to do, but I have picked up some of them. So first thing I would like to, just reacting to what you said, is about possible Larry Wolf of the Red Ruthenia. And then I would say that it's not only if we talk about meaning the problem of continuity or discontinuity of Galicia. I believe that there may be argument, and it's not a question for me, but maybe an argument of looking at Red Ruthenia historically and seeing what are the continuities. But the problem is that Galicia, as it was created by the Habsburgs, is not only Red Ruthenia. That there is western half of Galicia is part of the historical province of Małopolska, which never had anything to do with medieval Halic principality, which I believe the Habsburgs called Galicia because they needed a sort of legitimacy for taking this territory, but this is historically a different territory, so there should be, and there is also a plausible question of looking at continuity of prepartitions Małopolska and 19th century Galicia, but, well, still there are two different entities, and to square all three of them and say that both Red Ruthenia and Małopolska and 19th century Galicia, in a sense, form a sort of entity, that would be, I believe, really difficult indeed, and I'm at loss how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I decided not to develop this question anymore, but in a sense to say a few words about what is Galicia. So what is Galicia within broadly understood Polish history? I have chosen this problem not because of my radical Polish nationalism, but because I think, well, if organizers decided to invite a historian from Warsaw, then probably they expect from him to hear something about Galicia within the Polish context. And some question I put to myself: why is Galicia important for 19th century and probably also the Polish history? First two points which I want to mention are really very similar, although probably in a different configuration, to those that Andrzej Zajarniuk has already mentioned before the coffee break as regards the role of Galicia for Ukrainians. Versus the Polski Piemont, the same phrase that we have in Ukrainian national movement, we have also in Polish national movement. Galicia is a Piemont for the future Polish independence. Relatively similar story, late 19th, early 20th centuries. And second, as important is the constitutional everyday practice of life for which majority of Poles could not enjoy in Russian Empire at that time, in the same way as majority of Ukrainians could not enjoy in Russian Empire. So this is this, so to say, constitutional training, which I believe was quite important. But then there are also a few over points which I would like to mention. One very interesting point is that there is problem of Galician modernization. We were talking about role of Galicia in building Jewish modernity in political life in early 20th century. We could have analogous lectures about Galician constitutional politics in terms of Polish and Ukrainian political life, and I think it is really very important. What could even argue that the two present-day Polish bifurcation, yes, of political scene between, well, peace and its opposition starts with the period between just before 1913 with the division of Polish politics as regards the compromise with Ukrainians proposed by Krakow conservatists just on the eve of World War I. But this is in a sense the same general scheme of Polish political division starts in Galicia on the eve of World War I. But one could discuss this thesis. This is for a long time discussion. But what I want to say, this is I think somebody mentioned, probably it was Andrzej Zajarniuk once again in discussion, that after all, Galicia is much less modern in certain sense than both Ukrainian lands in Russian Empire and Polish lands in Russian Empire. If we look at heavy industry that develops in eastern Ukraine, if we look at heavy industry that develops around in Congress Poland around Lodz, if we look at statistics, then we see that Galicia compared with Russian Poland, with Congress Kingdom, then Congress Kingdom produces much more of something per capita of population than Galicia does. In certain sense, it is much more modern, and it was very common optic both of contemporaries and of historians that Galicia is actually backward. I believe that it was the turn from Marxist-oriented economic history to a sort of cultural and also institutional political history that helped us to understand that there are certain other branches than pure economy in which Galicia is more modern. One of them is the constitutionalism, another of them is partaking with the Habsburg cultural life, especially in Jugendstil culture, which is really very, very, very formative for Polish I don't know how far it is with Ukrainian, but for Polish 20th century culture, one could say that this is a sort of modernization whose main vehicle is a coffee house or a cabaret rather than a factory. But it is modernization all the same. So this Galician specificity of modernization, I think, is an important point. Another important point is the type of conservatism. That is, Galicia is ruled by Polish conservatives between 1867 and, say, last years before World War I. This rule breaks just on the eve of World War I. These are, so to say, looking from perspective of the 20th century, it is quite a specific type of conservatism. It's not modern type radical nationalism. These are traditional conservatives who want very much to modernize themselves. In a say, they want to make the same trick, which, as far as I know, the only person who succeeded to do it was Benjamin Disraeli. That is, to modernize a traditional, old-fashioned conservative party in such a way that it is a viable party in modern mass politics. They were trying this. They didn't succeed doing this. How much nicer would Polish 20th century history be if it were not Endecja, but the Krakow conservatives, who are the main force on the right side of the political scepter? We can all imagine. But one of these attempts, and I'm finishing, in one of these attempts of modernizing Polish culture by the Krakow conservatives was the so-called Krakow Historical School, which I think is one of the most important phenomena in Polish intellectual life of the 19th century, with extremely critical view of Polish national history, stressing the internal causes of collapse. When Michał Bobrzyński, who was later to be a viceroy of Galicia and trying to work out this Polish-Ukrainian compromise of 1913, but when as a young man he published his synthetic history of Poland in 1879, very, very, very critical of everything that average Polish intelligentsia thought worth it, then I believe the uproar, well, I know it's probably slightly demagogical analogy, but the uproar was similar to the moment when Jan Tomasz Gross published his book on Jedwabne in 2001. Bobrzyński was not about the Jewish question, but in a sense the contrast to the cherished view of national history was as strong as later with Jan Tomasz Gross. To have such conservatives, I would say, is a sort of achievement, I would think, and this, even if Bobrzyński as a person is forgotten, some of his ideas are not. It's quite funny that recently some more or less radically leftist books, revisionist on Polish history, really use big part of Bobrzyński's arguments without realizing it, or at least without quoting him. So in intellectual sphere, I think this Krakow school, historical school, is something that lasts. And I had some more things, but I suppose that overstressed my time. So
well, yeah, they may be picked up in discussion, which is what we want to reserve as much time as we can for. And another question I'll just throw out to everybody in terms of procedure: shall we hear everybody's brief remarks and then have a discussion? I would be leaning toward that. Yes? Good, fine. So our next presenter is Michael Silber, who's retired. Why is everyone retiring but me? Why am I so stupid? But before that, he was the Cardinal Franz Koenig Senior Lecturer in Austrian Studies, the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at Hebrew University. He was also chairman of the Executive Board of the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, and has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. And as many of you know, his research interests focus on early modern and modern Jewish history, particularly of Jews in the Habsburg Empire. So, retired emeritus Professor Silber, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pick up just one of the themes that we've talked about, and that is the question of modernization of Galicia, specifically the modernization of the Jews of Galicia. and I'm going to use this provocative title of In the Vanguard of Jewish Modernity, Galicia in two moments. One is 1789, and the other one is 1848. And the argument will be that Galicia, at these moments, the Jews of Galicia were ahead of all the other Jews in Europe in terms of modernization. And I think that all those who remember Franzos and Harb Asian, I think, it should come as a sort of a provocative sort of statement. So I'm going to start first with Joseph II. I'm going to, you've heard about already from Dirk Sadowski and from others about Joseph II's reforms, and the argument over here is first of all to displace the Germanocentric orientation. Most of the time when we look at the onset of Jewish modernity, we look at to Germany, to Prussia, to the Haskalah, to enlightened absolutism in Prussia, to Christian Wilhelm Dom. And what I want to do over here is make a very, very quick comparison between Germany and the Habsburg monarchy in the 18th century. So I'm going to look at three factors. One of them you've already heard, and that's the modern Jewish schools and the question of acculturation and secular education. That is Germany on the one side, and the other side of the Habsburg monarchy, specifically Galicia. The other one will be conscription of the Jews into the military, and over here this is a sort of a civil and social integration. Jews as sort of, we'll see, the performing duties to the state, but in the process of also serving in the military, you are also very much exposed to contacts with non-Jews and with the non-Jewish world, so that also is a sort of an opening. And the last thing that I want is égalité avant les lettres, which will talk about emancipation of sorts in Galicia in 1789 that precedes the debates in France, which take place around half a year later, and which cites the debates in France, cite the precedents of the Galician Edict. I think something that hasn't been done yet. Okay, so here is a typical sort of two maps. The top map is from the German Jewish History series edited by Michael Meyer and Michael Brenner. And what you see over here is an attempt to show the Jewish schools in the modern Jewish schools, as they call it, at the time in the 1780s. There is also an attempt not only to show on the map, that is, we're talking about the top, not only to show the actual schools on the map, but also to show that actually there were all sorts of people coming from Eastern Europe and elsewhere who had some sort of an impact. And that's why, for instance, I don't know if you can see it over here, but both Trieste and Prague are mentioned here. There were 6 schools established between 1780 to 1800 in the German lands. 6 schools. Compare this to what was happening at the same time in the Habsburg lands, which is the map at the bottom. You have roughly the total of around 200 schools established between 1780s until around 1790s, early 90s. 200. There's absolutely no comparison between the German situation and what you have in the Habsburg lands. And on top of that, take a look at Galicia and take a look at East Galicia, where you have tiny little städtlach that we usually associate with Hasidism or elsewhere. And you can see over here how they easily outnumber anything you had in Germany. Take into account that very few of these students actually succeeded in learning German. They're still by far, the numbers by far outnumber, and these include, by the way, not only boys but also girls. So that's the other one is with the compulsory conscription of Jews into the military. Although the debate over Jewish military conscription began in Prussia, it began with Christian Wilhelm Dom and afterwards Mendelssohn and others. They basically spoke about a distant time when Jews will be capable of serving in the army. I think Mendelssohn spoke about a century from now on. And then, of course, what you have is from up above, Joseph II comes, and in 1788 he simply imposes the duty of serving in the army, and the first ones who serve are the Jews in Galicia. I made the calculation at one point that roughly 35,000 Jewish soldiers served between 1788 until around 1815, during the Napoleonic Wars as well. In Prussia until 1812, zero. All right? Jews simply weren't there. So that's another element of integration that you have. The next one is a little bit more complicated, and this deals with toward emancipation of some sort. And it focuses on the question of land ownership. Is it a key to Jewish legal status? That's the question I ask. Land ownership in the Habsburg monarchy, divided the lands into various legal status that it had. It had dominical lands that were owned by the lord. You had rustical lands that were owned by serfs, and they had obligations to serve as a result. You had a third type of land, legal status, uncultivated land, but that was quite rare. So these three are to be kept in mind now. Now, of course, we know that Joseph II instituted this idea of Jews serving, that's by the way from Carpathians, of Jews serving, as agriculturalists in Neu-Babylon, near Bolachov, among other places. Usually this has been seen in terms of productivization. And the argument that I make over here is to look at 1789 at the Galician Judenpatent mentioned as System, which was called the Judensystem, by Joseph II, issued in May 1789, again around 6 months before you have the debates, or 7 months before you have the debates in the French National Assembly on emancipation. Now, what you have over here is the Edict of Toleration of Galicia has been downplayed a lot. People have sort of dismissed it, especially Carniel, but others, Mahler, that is, you can always look at it as the cup as being half empty. I would like to see it as half full. I don't care that much how much it was actually implemented. The idea is what was actually passed at this point. So there's a preface. Abolish all differences between Jews and non-Jews. Uses the word Gleichheit, equality, the same rights and the same obligations, and then you have various sections over here: religion, education, legal constitution of the community, judicial, civil matters, and obligations to the state. So let's just look over here. The corporate community is abolished. So we have as an X-corporation, and then because of this X-corporation, what you have in turn is a sort of an incorporation of the Jews into the various institutions that already exist. So Jews collectively, institutionally, will be only for religious purposes like a guild. Politically, they belong now to the local authority, and they can vote and be elected. This is, as far as the judiciary goes, the abolish of Jewish courts, duties, military service. Now look at the end of 48. There's something which I think people have, it's very easy to miss. And I'm going to have to look at it also because it's very much in. But it says, where they are serfs of local lords, they must behave according to the new urbarial rules. What does that mean? It means that when Jews are plowing, they're not just productivization is involved, but now if they happen to be plowing on the land that is rustical, then they are basically serfs. This is what you start having. And this, of course, goes very well with the whole notion of incorporation. Here you had a Jewish communal corporation that was set apart from what you had until then. You now have equality, and the question, of course, asks, incorporated into what? And the question of equality means, what does it mean in a society of orders? Jacob Katz said in Germany, of course, that integration meant integration to the middle class, which probably makes sense in most cases. But what you have over here is that we've seen that this would be the burgher class, but what you have over here is for the first time you have this notion of Jews legally defined as possible serfs. I don't know how many there were, probably not many, but anyway, the notion that this is possible, that's also there as well. So here you have the thing of the questions. The next question, of course, if you have burghers and you have serfs, well, do you also have Jewish nobles? And the answer is yes. Joseph II creates the possibility for Jews to not only to work on rustical land, but actually to purchase dominical land, manorial lands. And of course, what follows from that is that you have the first non-converted Jew under Joseph II, who is then ennobled, and this is Israel Hernig, who is granted that title. All right, here he is, very nice. This is the first part of it. So what you have over here is Josephian legislation precedes the deliberations of French National Assembly, and these are actually cited by Clermont-Tonnerre in his famous December 23rd speech in the French National Assembly, everything for, refuse anything to the Jews as a nation, but grant everything to the Jews as individuals. There he says very clearly, you can see it yellowed out, that the Jews in the lands of the emperor now enjoy the rights of citizens, right? And not only that, but they also enjoy the honorifics, that is, of being noble, that we have already destroyed by us. That is, it's seen as a sort of a thing. And not only that, but Jews themselves, after the initial disappointment of not receiving the emancipation, they say, look, things are much better in the lands of the Habsburgs than it is over here. So again, Jews are ahead in terms of acculturation in Galicia. They're ahead of Germany. They're ahead in politically in 1789 of the Jews in France, right? So in both cases you have that. Now I'm turning to 1848. 1848, what we have is something that I think has been neglected until now, and this is the question of mass politicization of Galician Jews. In 1848, I'm going to look at something very specific, and that's mass petitions. Mass petitions already begin in 1848 among the Ruthenians, for instance, something like 250,000 Ruthenians. I don't know how they sign, maybe just by X's, but all sorts of demands are then put forward. At first, Jewish politicians are very wary of petitions. Isaac Mayer Mannheimer, the preacher in Vienna, famously said, "No petitions. You know, we expect it to happen. We don't have to beg for anything like that." Of course, he said that, and within a few weeks he was petitioning in any case. But here's what we want to see. We know that there were petitions of Galician Jews to the Reichstag because Balaban published this. But Balaban, when he published this, he just took a leaflet and he published that. But he didn't tell us that this was a mass petition that was actually signed, that you had people actually signing. And this is what you had, is not just one petition, but you had 5 petitions at that time in August of 1848. And what we had is a breakdown of something like 38 communities in August published 3 different petitions, and then afterwards, once again in September, another 22. And if you look at this is the order of the signatures, you can see that it wasn't initiated at all by the big communities. Krakow didn't want to have anything to do with the rest of Galician Jewry. Brody, because perhaps it had elected Mannheimer, didn't want to have any petitions at all. Lviv started with something, but basically it was left out. It was the petition drive that was began in Stanislav and also in Tisminitz. Those are the ones that were copied. They were the ones who actually initiated the whole business, and they started. How do these petitions look? This is how, by the way, the map looks. It's primarily an Eastern Galician sort of phenomenon, very little in the West, and you can see they're actually one after the other sort of moving on. We know the dates, how it's done. This is how the petitions look. This is Zholkev. You have the petition on the left, and here you have the signatures. As you can see, some of the signatures are by the same person, but signed several times. But most of the time, what is very impressive is that you have very fluent type of signatures over here. These are not people who, like, Yosef Peral said, Megalet Mirin, who can barely read Gothic letters. These are people who obviously are controlling the signatures as well. This is Zholkev. Let me go on to Buchach. Yeah, Buchach. I don't know, maybe you'll find over here something that you'll find useful of the type of things they have. This is another type of signatures. This is Tisminitz, and Tisminitz has very important things. They're the ones who actually begin this type of thing, especially those who belong to the Laser and Forschitz Verein.
He's taking the microphone.
Okay, those are the ones who have over here. These are the ones who actually are doing that. And if you look carefully, there are 2 people here who are worthy of notice. I don't know if you can see the red. Can you see the red? In the middle over here, this is Jacob Freud. It's Siggy's father, the unheroic Freud, who signs this. What is even more impressive is the head of the community who signs the beginning, and that's in the other end, all the way at the bottom, and it's a guy called Shlomo Freud. So that's his grandfather. They're the ones who are actually among the ones who are initiating this type of thing. Here you have a signature of Jakob Freud. You can see him when he's in Moravia and when he's not. This is Zhuravno. Zhuravno is interesting because there we also have Rabbi Shmelkes, who is a rabbi, but he's got a younger brother. And the younger brother tells what happened in 1848. He said at one point the Polish local nobility invited the Jews to come and take part in some sort of protest, but the communal authorities, the Orthodox, were against it. And Shmelkes writes, I chose to join the liberals. I can state that from this day on, I broke completely with orthodoxy and with all the rigorous and strict religious customs. You can see a young man over here, he is still a teenager, being politically mobilized and becoming that way, all right? And so this is just to summarize. So, Galician Jews were the first in modern times to sign a mass petition demanding emancipation. Nothing like this you have among any of the other Jewries. As far as I know, in 1848, no other mass petitions took place. The Jews did not produce any mass petition. Not the Hungarians, not the Bohemian and the Moravians, not the Viennese that we're talking about. In Vienna, there was maybe something at the very beginning. Nothing in Germany, nothing of this sort. This is the one place where you have mass petitions, so that's already something. There are 9,000 signatories over here in something like 63 communities, mainly concentrated in East Galicia, as I said. And this is we have to recall something about East Galicia. East Galicia is the densest area of Jewish population in the world. There's nothing like that. And this goes back since the 18th century. It's just the densest part, especially the Rus part, the Eastern Galician part. And that's basically how to understand. It's not only the densest, but it also has the densest network of communities. You have nothing like that any other place. So that's also something to keep in mind. It represented around, I would say, the signatories around 10% of those who actually were around. I think about 2/3 were original signatures in Latin or German characters. The rest in Hebrew, or someone else signed for them. In Zlochev, even 7 women signed, so we have over here gender thing. Don't think that I ignore this stuff. 21 rabbis signed. It's also something. Some of them were very prominent. But there are certain, like I said, surprising absences. Brody, Krakow, you don't have that. And it was mainly the mid-sized communities. And finally, I must say that if you look at the red line, you'll find 3 people who are called Bratspis. One of them must be one of my ancestors. One of them signed in a broken sort of German signature. The others apparently couldn't do it, and it's in Hebrew. So that's what you have. But what is striking is that most of them were capable of signing the names in German things. So there you have it. Jews of Galicia in the vanguard of modernity. Thank you.
Wonderfully refreshing. Actually, for some of us, not surprising and just confirming what we always felt about Galicia. Our next presenter is Larry Wolf, and the description that I've been given has a blank after his name, because I was told that either there was nothing to say about you as an introduction, or everyone knows already.
So I'm going to make some informal remarks, brief informal remarks, since I've had a chance to talk already at some length. What is Galicia? I'm going to double down on the idea that it's invented in 1772. If we think about the Hungarian justification, what you want to remember is that at the moment of the first partition of Poland, Frederick the Great supposedly remarks about Maria Theresa, plus elle pleure, plus elle prend. The more she cries, the more she takes. Frederick and Catherine were both completely cynical about the partitions of Poland. Maria Theresa was troubled in her conscience by the pillaging of a Catholic state, another Catholic state. The Hungarian justification was invented by Kaunitz in order to make her feel better. And he presented it to her as a reason why this could be considered legitimate, and she took the bait and decided that she could stop crying and begin administering, because she was a practical woman after all. When the Hungarians at the time of the Ausgleich in 1867 suggested that perhaps Galicia should be part of Hungary since it had been claimed as part of Hungary, that was ruled absolutely out of court. So the Hungarian claim was not validated at the moment of the Ausgleich. Who's a Galician? It's a hard question to answer, because what I would want to emphasize about this is it's not just often a hyphenated identity, as we've suggested, a Russian, Jewish, Ukrainian, Polish, as I've suggested to you, even a French Galician, but it's both an overlapping identity and an evolving identity. An overlapping identity in the sense that it's an identity that's held alongside a variety of other identities, often a religious identity, sometimes a national identity. Galician was a provincial identity that mediated among other identities, and the marvelous Krakow conservatives whom Maciej proposed, and we spent some time talking about them yesterday in the evening as one way of looking at who was Galician, used to evade the question when they wrote about it and just referred to it as nasz kraj, which could be a little bit the way you would refer to Israel as the land haaretz, right? It evaded the naming of Galicia, so that it might be Galicia and maybe it could even be Poland, although that would be more usually nasza ojczyzna, if you were looking for it more explicitly. But the idea that it's a mediating or evasive identity that combines or allows you to mingle different identities is, I think, part of what it is, also evolving over time. I would say it means almost nothing to people in 1772. It's just a new sovereignty. But by the middle of the 19th century, as I suggested to you yesterday, people are willing to weep over the return to their Galician homelands, and there are certainly people who weep over its passing in 1918. Does Galician survive as an identity without Galicia? We've suggested that in memory, in many ways it does, but one of the things to remember about identities is that they are not just evolving, but evolutionary. That is to say, some of them survive, some of them don't. History has left behind all kinds of identities that don't survive into the modern world, and the Galician identity is one that jostles with and competes with other kinds of identities that people could hold in that territory. Third point I want to make as a fundamental for understanding what it means to be Galician. Josh put it up on the screen yesterday, but we didn't really talk about it. It's Article 19. Article 19 of the Austrian Constitutional Law of 1867 defines in a very powerful way what it means to be Galician. Article 19 is the constitutional right that you have as a Volksstamm, as a collectivity, to national rights to justice, education, and administration in your own language. It's something astonishing to present, and probably careless to set up as a constitutional right in 1867. And we could say that the Habsburgs spend the rest of their existence as a state, Austria-Hungary, trying to figure out how to implement those kinds of collective rights for a mixed population. And if we were thinking, in the case of Galicia, it's part of what sets up a Piedmont in which you have political practice for both Poles and Ukrainians who are not only competing in parliamentary elections, but are competing for certain kinds of collective national rights. When we think about Jewish history, 1789 is a landmark, 1848 is a landmark, 1867 is a more questionable landmark because it opens up collective rights but denies them to Jews. Because while Jews are fully emancipated in 1867 and possess all of the individual human rights that the Constitutional law guarantees, Yiddish is not recognized as one of the languages of the empire. It's not a choice on the census of 1880, which will begin the very complex implementation of Article 19, and the frustrations and the complexities of what it means to be, and we talked about this a lot beginning yesterday, what it means to be modern and politically Jewish. And Josh's book is really interesting in this regard. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Stems from the fact that Jews don't have these collective rights under Article 19, and one of the things it means to be nationally Jewish is to advocate those national rights, which means advocating Yiddish as a national language. And it's one form of Jewish nationalism that exists within Galicia alongside the better known and ultimately more promising Zionist form of Jewish nationalism. Fourth point I want to make. In this very competitive political situation that's created by Article 19, in which nationalities are all competing with one another for collective rights, there is an imperial fantasy of transcending these national differences, which is important throughout the Habsburg monarchy and very important in Galicia itself. For me, one of the most interesting moments is the moment in the 1890s and 1894 when the provincial exhibition is set up in Lviv, in which the province Galicia presents itself in an exhibition, its products, its landscape. The culmination is a hall of costumes in which you have a set of mannequins wearing the different folk costumes of Galicia. And the culmination of the culmination is that Franz Josef travels from Vienna to witness the Galicia, not just the real Galicia, which is politically very fraught and complicated, but the fantasy Galicia of the exhibit, in which his people are a set of mannequins colorfully dressed in folk costume and fully at peace with one another, because after all, they are mannequins. I should say that the presence of the emperor is one of the things that makes Galicia Galicia, because in my understanding of the invented Galicia of 1772, the Galicia which passes into history in 1918, the idea of Galicia is inseparable from Habsburg rule, and it's hard for me to think of it outside of that category. Slavko Hrycak once pointed out to me the tree outside of Lviv where Franz Josef is supposed to have stopped to piss on his way to the exhibit in 1894. It was his land. He marked it in his own fashion. And it seemed astonishing to me that one might remember that tree 100 years later. I was very moved by that as well. If we think about the relationship between Galicia and its emperor, Franz Josef, one of the things that I was thinking about when we had our discussions about language, German and Yiddish, over the course of these last 2 days is a moment in Josef Roth's novel Radetzky Marsh, where Franz Josef is a character in it. You're given point of view, Franz Josef, in Radetzky Marsh, and he comes to Galicia in the final section of the novel, and he's greeted by a group of Jewish elders. Perhaps they're rabbis. Maybe they're actually carrying Torahs as they greet the emperor. But what I remember, and I don't have the novel with me, so I didn't check this. What I remember very strikingly about this moment is they express their devotion to the emperor, and the emperor's chamberlain, who is next to him, comments to the emperor, says, "I could not understand anything that those old men were saying." And the emperor says to his chamberlain, "That is because they were not speaking to you." And Galicia is the realm where you speak directly to the emperor, and he understands you when you speak to him. Last point I want to make. I mentioned to the people at lunch, the people I was having lunch with, that one of the weird projects I've been involved with over the course of the last 15 years or so is I've served on the Vatican committee that was considering for beatification the last Habsburg Empress, Zita. Collecting documents for this committee and weighing in on her historical record in trivial ways that I think will not matter very much in Rome. But say I'm the guy who's read Zita's FBI file and passed it on to the beatification committee. It's pretty weird for a historian. It's been super interesting. And I've been trying to think a little bit about Galicia in relation to the research I've been doing about fairy tale conceptions of emperors and empresses in the 20th century, because, of course, beatification would be the highest form of fairy tale apotheosis. I did mention, maybe it was at lunch, we talked about this also, Pope John Paul II had a particular Galician reverence for Karl and Zita, the last Habsburg emperor and empress, and supposedly was named for Karl by his Habsburg devoted Galician father, that is to say, named Karol Wojtyła for Emperor Karl. But I know that when Zita went to Rome in the 1980s, because Zita lived to be until 1989. She reigned from 1916 to 1918 and lived until 1989. And when she went to Rome in the 1980s for an audience with Pope John Paul II, she knelt down before him and he raised her up and said, "Rise up, Empress of my father." So there's a Galician connection that lasts for a long time. But what I wanted to talk about here was a little piece of research that I was doing around an opera called The Woman Without a Shadow, Die Frau ohne Schatten. The music is by Richard Strauss, and the libretto is by the great Viennese poet Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Von Hofmannsthal because he is descended from an ennobled Jew from the late 18th century, and who was his great grandfather. And in the first act of the opera, we are introduced to a spirit empress living in a heavenly palace who cannot have a child with her husband, the emperor, because she has no shadow. And the whole plot of the opera is how an empress can learn to be human, acquire a human shadow, and eventually have children and perpetuate her dynasty. Ironically, the opera is performed in Vienna in 1919 at exactly the moment that the last emperor and empress go into exile forever, leaving Austria, and the moment when they enter into the world of becoming fairy tales themselves in their imperial afterlives. End of the first scene, the empress is told that to find a shadow, she must descend to the human world and acquire a shadow from a human being. And the day is dawning, and it's a great soprano role. She sings, "Ein Tag bricht an," right? A day is dawning, and her nurse reminds her that it's ein Menschentag. It's going to be a human day down there, and describes the human world to her as alles Streben ohne Freude, right? It's all striving without joy. Now, those words actually come out of Hofmannsthal's letters from the 1890s when he was doing his military service in Galicia, in Tłumacz. He described it, writing back to Vienna, as a terribly depressing world, alles Streben ohne Freude. And he didn't mean his military life, he meant Galicia itself. And when I realized that it was echoed in the libretto of the opera, I was very struck by that still in 1919, Hofmannsthal, when he thinks about what it means for an empress to learn how to be human, he imagines her coming into contact with the human world of Galicia. Thank you.
I've been told by our organizers that we can go until 18:15, so we have nearly 15 minutes. Very briefly, do any of you have anything else to say about what was said by your colleagues, but no more than a minute?
Yes.
No, please.
A minute about the mannequins who are not quarreling because they are mannequins. I think, and I probably should have said it earlier, that one of the central elements of this Habsburg political experience, constitutionalization and so on, was something that I would call a theatralization of ethnic conflict, which means it much less strong than it looks from sources and from the phraseology. In a sense, everybody is accustomed to certain type of phraseology, and I think that probably some historians today do not notice it and ascribe to these conflicts more strength than probably they really had because of this theatralization. The danger is, I believe, that just with mass politics on the eve of World War I, that comes a new generation of politicians who do not understand these conventional theatralizations, and the same phrases that their parents were using as a part of ritual, they are, so to say, start to taking them seriously, and then story. They stop to be mannequins in a sense, and that's not the best thing.
And if I may, my one comment, following up on the position of Polish historiography echoed by Larry Wolff, and not moving an inch from 1772 to 1918 as defining Galicia, you said, well, you have problems because there was West Galicia as well, and how would that fit in? Well, I think that's, I would argue, relatively easy in the sense that Galicia is not only an administrative, but a historical territory, and historical territories, like states, expand and contract. And so this is really a question of, if one wants to create a historical construct of Galicia that runs from the medieval period to the present, it can be done. It's really a question, states create themselves in the same way as we know, so these things can be done. It's just a question of how convincing they are done, when they're being done, and in the future.
So what you want to tell me is that in 1772 the Halic Principality conquered Krakow, yes?
Well, but interestingly, Krakow was not, this is an interesting, Krakow was not even part of Galicia until 1848, and so that's also...
It was until Napoleonic period.
Okay, fine, all right, but then for the long period it wasn't, fine, okay.
So it's 46.
Yes, but
46, yeah.
yes,
But in any case, these things can be done, is my point. Whether they want to be done or whether they're convincing is a different story.
Let me okay. Apropos Zita, Otto von Habsburg was at the Hebrew University, I think, around 20, 30 years ago. And Otto von Habsburg came to the Hebrew University, I think, in the 1990s, and he let drop this idea, I too have some sort of, Jewish roots. And the idea was, of course, that Zita, as a Braganza, were descendants of the first Prince of Braganza and his Jewish mistress, which pretty much there's a parallel to, of course, Kazimir and Esterka there.
Okay. Yes.
Just very thank you for these really very inspiring presentations. One short comment to Michael. The role of the military, I think, is really very important to understand the trajectory of a political project. I did once, a very rough count of the Jews in the legions, in Pilsudski's legions. And I don't know, I assume there are better informed experts in this room than myself, but in my account, the number of Jews in the legions was actually higher than their proportion in the population. So one aspect of what makes Galicia in the course of the 19th century is a buy-in, which is very considerable. And which is exceptional, and one indication, and following up on what you said, so very interesting.
We know that the reserve officers in the Habsburg army during World War I were 17% were Jewish, precisely because as a reserve, you were a reserve officer if you finished the gymnasium, whatever you did. So it was 17%. In the Hungarian Honvéd, István Deák noted that the officers were something like 37%. So in terms of there was certainly true in terms of non-commissioned officers, non-commissioned sergeants and all that. This was a very typical Jewish sort of position.
Right behind you.
Oh, okay. So two small comments to Michael. You read that paragraph from 1789 Josephinian patent about the abolishment of the corporate community, limiting its function to religious issues. But the clergy, whether Christian or Jewish, they recorded the vital statistics, which is a civil function of marriage, birth, death, and so on. And this is why the district rabbi is really defined by the Habsburg Empire, because he's in charge of recording those statistics. So it's not limited to religious function only. And this is rather, they also got money for registering that. I just wanted to add that. And to Larry Wolf, the Article 19, there was a similar article also, I think in the first Constitution of 1848. Yes. I don't think they defined the Volksstimme there also. But when the Constitution was published, Jews did not demand collective rights, only individual rights. It happens only later with politicization and so on. You mentioned the Yiddish, which is not a common language of all Jews in the Habsburg Empire. It's really a Galician phenomenon. But they didn't argue about it. They didn't petition after this Article 19 was published. It took a while. So I think the Jews were the last group to jump on the national wagon, so to speak. So
I don't know the precise chronology about this. Josh probably knows better than I do, but I would guess the crucial moment is following the 1880 census, when it becomes very clear that census by language is going to be the means for allocating rights according to Article 19.
Yeah, and Birnbaum, who's not exactly a Galician, is a very important figure.
As far as I know, as I remember, the first campaign for Yiddish to be recognized as an Umgangssprache was after 1890. There really wasn't a movement in 1880. But 1890, there was a big push to get it recognized and to get Jews, because you got fined or jailed if you didn't pay the fine if you wrote Yiddish. You had to choose one of the recognized ones. I think 1890, as far as I know, as I recall.
Yep. 90, of course, was also a census year.
Yeah, that's why I said it.
Yep.
Every 10 years, yeah.
Professor Bartal. Moment, the microphone, which is right behind you.
Mystical device.
I wonder what the panelists think of a comparative perspective of the three powers partitioning Poland in terms of this multi-ethnic constitution of Galicia, and why is it so that only in Galicia we have something unique that created this kind of, if you like, Galician heritage or Galician long-term memory, unlike other parts of the partitions. Especially, I'm bothered about what happens in the so-called Novorossiya, New Russia, and of course the Prussian. In all three cases, actually, we have, enlightened absolutism, so-called, many of the components, of course, in different numbers, in different, if you like, ethnic groups, different ethno-religious groups. However, actually, Galicia stands out for this, and unlike the Prussian case, and having in mind the Jewish case, actually, the issue of in what way the Jews being kind of an imperial nation has it in the Galician case.
That's a good point.
I would remind Professor Bartel that Litvaks seem to have some kind of a collective memory. It's not quite the same thing. But I wanted to say...
Hold on. Can we hold on? Can we follow?
This is relevant.
Yeah, if it's related to this, because then we want to follow on the same theme.
Okay, I just wanted to say that being a Galiciano is not always such a thing that you are proud of. That there are plenty of people who try to. I remember Jeanette Baron used to say she was Austrian from Tarnów, and lots of people who descended from Krakow, especially for some reason, used to say they're descended from the 3 Sephardi Jews who came to Krakow. It's not always a positive dimension.
I was
sorry.
I was just wondering whether you would agree, Maciej, that there is also some kind of sense of connection to the Kresy, right? Both for Poles and for Jews who have that Lithuanian identity. I'm thinking of, say, the way Miłosz wrote deep into the 20th century about Lithuania.
Well, actually, yes, because Miłosz writing about Lithuania is a sort of Lithuanian type of Landespatriotismus, and this is the Krajowcy, the Kraj ideology. So they are analogies, and they are not, I would believe, not recorded between the Habsburg Landespatriotismus and this Litwoojczyzno moja, the Polish patriotic Lithuanian idea. If I may, something about the paragraph 19th and also about the specificity of Galician tradition. There is, as far as I understand it, the fact that the 1867 constitution did not envisage the Jews as a separate nationality was then still in the assimilationist mood, meant as a device to escape anti-Semitism, because the idea was at that time, both among Jewish assimilationists and non-Jewish liberals, that if you separate the Jews legally, then you do it in order to stigmatize them, not in order to give them full tolerance. Then, in next 50 years, the modern nationalist ideas, including Zionist development, what was meant as a sort of equality of the Jews becomes seen as a handicap. But as it was, even in early 20th century, one of the Polish Jewish assimilationists, Tobiasz Ashkenazy, wrote in Krytyka, this Wilhelm Feldman journal, that in East Central Europe, whenever you give to the Jews a collective identity, you do it in order to persecute them and not in order to be nice to them. Yes, so that it's in Russia Jews have collective identity. He wrote, but doesn't mean that they are that they have equal rights. So I believe this was the type of reasoning that guided the people who passed the 1867 constitution. And as regards the Galician specificity, again, I can only say from Polish perspective, I would think that in Polish tradition, Austria was never a serious enemy. So that it may be that it was a bit funny, it may be a sort of Schweikian way, but it was not an enemy. And of course, one could say
What is not an enemy?
Austria.
Austria.
In the Polish tradition?
Yeah.
Long term, because you could send 1848, 1846, 1846, of course, but still, from a long perspective, compared with Russian and German stereotypized vision, I would still defend the idea that it is not comparable. And then, if I may say so, very un-postmodernist way, objectively, yes, the situation of the Poles after 1867 in Galicia was much better than in two other partitions. So in a sense, this feelings of specificity developed, although one should remember, it is well known in historiography, but I've forgotten that in Russian Poland, Wielopolski introduced the civil emancipation of the Jews just on the eve of 1863 uprising, in 1862. And this was the only one reform of Wielopolski which was retained after the uprising. So the Jews, of course, they didn't have political rights in Russian Poland, but then probably nobody had political rights, but they have civic rights. That is, they were able to buy land, they were able to move to cities, they were able to conduct civil business before the court in the same way as the rest of the population. So in this sense, it is an important element, I believe, as regards Polish-Jewish relations in late 19th century, but it didn't develop into a sort of, I would say, memory of...
So I would just qualify that by saying that I do think that 1846 is really traumatic for Galicians and remains traumatic to
Wyspiański,
at least till Wyspiański, because it plays a role in Wesela. Szela makes his return in Wesela, but I don't think that's something that's merely literary. I think that that's deeply present, and certainly for the Krakow conservatives, among others, as the ways in which the Habsburgs can do them harm.
Let me just, I just want to say something. In 1846, what has always struck me is how the Jacquerie did not touch the Jews. It's very, very striking that you would expect this type of thing, and you didn't have it. By the way, Salom Baron's grandfather received a medal from the emperor for his job in, denouncing all the Polish rebels and stuff like that. I just want to say something about 1848. 1848, I think still Jews were seen as a collectively, as a sort of a nation. If you look at the censuses, the census of 1850 and the census of 1857 still lists the Jews as a separate nation. This begins to change in the 1860s, and you're quite right. I mean, what you have is, of course, the liberals in Austria who are not at all interested in that, but you have to look at the debates of the statisticians who really have to establish the rubrics as far as nationality goes. Well, it wasn't nationality, but these things come up. When you're talking about census, you have to really ask yourself, well, what are the criteria for setting up who is a Volksstamm?
Right, yeah.
If anything, Jews were called always a Volksstamm, and maybe not so much as a Nation. So, but that's also.
We are now 5 minutes over our allotted time, but I'm sorry, I cannot let this go, at least under the topic of Galicia après Galicia. I had raised it in the beginning. We have sitting in the room amongst our people a distinguished professor of history and kind of cultural figure in Galicia, in the person of Jaroslav Hrycak. In this context, as what we are talking, is the idea of Galician specificity, not just simply nostalgic, not just simply playing around, but actually to a degree of seriousness in relation to the rest of Ukraine that we have seen from time to time. Is it now dead?
Absolutely not. That's the shortest question, the shortest answer we could provide. I'll probably tell it later tomorrow, because I'll show you some maps that will prove my answer.
Okay, good. Well, I've asked the question. We got a very straightforward answer, and therefore the idea of Galicia lives on even in modern-day Ukraine. And thank you very much first and foremost to all of our panelists for the terribly wonderful, I'm using kind of a Slavic formula here, simply wonderful presentation, and also to the audience for their commentary. Thank you, and have a rest of the evening.